Can someone take her to a nursing home already? Chloe sneered across the dinner table, not even lowering her voice. She eats, she sits, she brings her dead grandma's crap. What does she actually do? I froze, my hands clinging to the box of family memories I had carried on the bus for 2 hours. Peter said nothing. He just kept eating. At that moment, I realized I wasn't family anymore. But the silence they gave me would soon echo, louder than any of their cruel words. My name is Agnes Miller. I'm 73 years old. I've been a mother longer than I've been anything else. A wife once, a bookkeeper before retirement. A quiet woman most of my life. But above all, I've always been the one who held the family together. Holidays, birthdays, Sunday meals. I was the thread that stitched us into something called home. At least, I used to be. These days, I feel more like an afterthought. A faded photograph in a box no one opens. That Saturday, I pressed my gray cardigan with care and tied my hair into a low bun. I held a small wooden box in my hands, a keepsake passed down from my mother. Inside were things no one asked about anymore. An old photograph, a pressed flower, a silver locket I once wore every Sunday. Things that once meant family. Peter, my only son, had called earlier that week. "You can come by Saturday," he said. "Chloe's parents are visiting too, so just keep it low-key." I heard the hesitation. He didn't say he missed me, but I went anyway. It took me 2 buses to reach their house, once ours, now utterly foreign. Chloe opened the door. "Oh, you're early," she said, not quite hiding her displeasure. She didn't hug me, just turned and walked away, assuming I'd follow. I stepped into the living room where Peter once played with building blocks and begged me to read bedtime stories. Now everything was cold. White walls, expensive decor, phones in hands, no warmth. Chloe's parents were already seated, sipping wine. Peter gave me a stiff nod. "Hey, Mom." I sat at the edge of the couch, the wooden box resting on my lap. No one asked about it. No one asked about me. Lunch was served, quinoa salad, some roasted vegetables, a tray of cheese I couldn't name. I wasn't asked what I'd like. I wasn't asked anything. Trying to break the silence, I said softly, "You know the kitchen still has those old tiles I helped pick when you moved in." Chloe didn't even look up. "We're getting rid of them next month. They're outdated." I smiled politely, biting the inside of my cheek. Outdated fit more than just tiles, apparently. Still, I held on to hope. Maybe if I shared something meaningful, they'd remember. I opened the box. "Peter," I said, holding up the silver locket, "you used to play with this when you were little. It was your grandmother's." That's when Chloe laughed, loud and cruel. "Can someone take her to a nursing home already? She eats, she sits, she brings her dead grandma's crap. What does she actually do?" My hands tightened around the box. My body didn't move, but my heart recoiled like it had been slapped. Peter, my son, my sweet boy. He didn't say a word. He just stared at his plate and kept eating. That silence screamed louder than Chloe's words. I closed the box carefully, trying not to let my hands shake. I stood. "I think I'll go now," I whispered. No one protested. Chloe actually looked relieved. "I'll get your bag," she said. Before I reached the door, she had already placed my worn suitcase outside, like garbage. I bent down, picked it up myself, and turned back one last time, not to see them, but to remember this feeling, this final cut. Not long ago, I was the woman who made this house feel like a home. Now I was just the old woman who stayed too long at the table. But something inside me stirred, a tiny voice, a pulse. They thought I was weak because I was quiet, but silence can hold power too. They had no idea what I was about to do. I don't remember how long I stood on that porch. My suitcase rested beside me like a discarded item. My shadow stretched across the concrete like the remnants of something once whole, now fractured. Every step I took away from their house felt like peeling off layers of my past, one painful inch at a time. I didn't cry, I didn't scream, I simply fell into silence, the kind of silence that wraps around your throat and settles in your bones. I ended up in a small, dimly lit room at the back of an old boarding house. Judith, an old friend from my church days, helped me find it. She didn't ask what happened. She just looked at me, held my hand, and said, "You're not staying there another night. Come." There was a narrow bed, a second-hand dresser, and a window that barely let the light in. From that window, I could see nothing but the back wall of a laundromat. Still, it was more honest than that bright, sterile house filled with silent cruelty. At night, I sat on the edge of the bed, afraid to lie down, afraid to sleep, afraid of dreaming about a home I no longer had. I sat for hours in the dark. No TV, no music, just me and the hum of loneliness. Time stretched, thoughts tangled. My body was still, but my mind paced like a prisoner in a cell. That's when the questions began. What did I do wrong? Did I talk too much? Was I just a burden? Peter used to call me his safe place. He'd say it with his little arms wrapped around my waist, his head tucked into my side. Now he let his wife talk about nursing homes, about me, like I wasn't even human, and he said nothing. That silence screamed louder than words. I didn't want to think about it, but the memories came anyway, sharp, clear, and cruel. That house, I helped buy it. I drained my retirement account so Peter could qualify for the mortgage. He never asked for it, but I gave it anyway. Because that's what mothers do. We sacrifice, we build, we disappear. I remembered the silver locket inside the box Chloe called junk. I had worn it every Christmas since I was 23. It wasn't just a necklace, it was my mother, my grandmother, my story. I opened the jewelry box one afternoon, not for nostalgia, but because I needed proof that I wasn't crazy, that I had once mattered, that I had lived a life of love, sacrifice, and purpose. I took the locket into my palm. It felt cold, heavy, real. I looked at it and whispered, more to myself than anyone else, "This is not garbage. This is me. This is where I come from. This is what I've carried, and no one gets to erase that." And suddenly I understood. They didn't just mock the objects. They rejected the history I carried. They hated the weight of memory, the inconvenience of values. They preferred things that were shiny, filtered, new. And I wasn't new. I was 73. I had stretch marks, wrinkles, and stories too old for social media. But I also had a spine. For days, I had been mourning the loss of a family I thought I still had. Now I realized I was mourning an illusion. They had stopped seeing me long ago, but I had been holding on, thinking love alone would keep me there. I was wrong, but I wasn't weak. I sat up straighter, my fingers tightening around the locket. I opened my phone and scrolled through the contacts until I saw his name, Charles Whitman, my lawyer from years ago. A quiet, kind man who helped me draft a will, back when I thought I'd die surrounded by family. I pressed call. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Agnes? Well, my goodness, it's been a long time." I closed my eyes and took a steady breath. "Hi, Charles. I need to make a change to my will. I want to update the beneficiary on the house, and I'd like to do it as soon as possible." Charles agreed to meet the next morning. He didn't ask many questions on the phone, but I could hear the curiosity in his voice. I hadn't spoken to him in nearly 8 years. The last time was when I updated my will after Peter got married. He welcomed me with a warm handshake and a frown of concern. "Agnes, you look tired." "I am," I said truthfully, "but not in the way you think." We sat in his office, a cozy space with worn leather chairs and the scent of old books. It reminded me of things that lasted, unlike what I had become in my son's house, replaceable. "I want to change the deed," I told him. "To what?" he asked gently. "To the Southern Women's Historical Preservation Society," I replied. 50% ownership, effective immediately." He blinked. "That's unorthodox." "So is throwing your mother's suitcase out like trash," I replied. He leaned forward. "Agnes, are you sure? That house is still in your name, and you've invested a lot." "I invested more than money," I interrupted. "I invested my life, and they decided it was worthless." He nodded slowly. "We'll draw up the papers. It'll take a few days." "Thank you." But that wasn't the hard part. The hard part was being alone again after making the decision. Back in the rented room, I stared at the beige walls. Was I making a mistake? Was I letting years of love be overwritten by one cruel moment? My heart pulled me in 2 directions. One part still yearned for Peter's voice, his hand on mine saying, "I'm sorry, Mom, I should have stopped her." Another part whispered, he had his chance, and he chose silence. I thought of calling him. I even drafted a message. "Peter, I love you. I just wanted you to know that." But I didn't send it. Because it wasn't just about love anymore. It was about respect, about value, about what it means to be seen. Love without respect is a prison. And I had lived in it too long. Later that evening, I took out the locket again. Not to mourn, but to remember. The silver gleamed softly under the lamplight, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. This locket had survived generations. Women tougher than me had worn it through war, migration, poverty. And here I was, mourning over a table setting and a daughter-in-law's sneer. I laughed quietly to myself, not because it was funny, but because I had finally snapped out of it. "They don't hate the locket," I whispered. "They hate what it represents, a woman who doesn't shrink." That night I couldn't sleep. My mind was awake, clear, determined. I thought back to every moment Chloe had interrupted me, rolled her eyes at me, spoken to me like I was some antique fixture taking up space. And Peter, always looking away, always avoiding the fight. They didn't see me. They saw an inconvenience with gray hair. A woman who'd had her time. Well, I wasn't done yet. The next morning, I packed my things into 2 bags. Judith came by to drive me to a new place, a studio apartment near the community library. Nothing fancy, but mine. I could arrange every photo, every book, every memory the way I wanted. I could paint the walls purple if I felt like it. And no one would tell me it was outdated. As we pulled up in front of the apartment, Judith looked at me. "You okay?" "I'm getting there," I said, "and I'm not going back." She nodded, squeezed my hand. "You're stronger than they know." I smiled. So am I. The apartment smelled like new paint and possibility. I placed the locket on the kitchen counter like a badge of honor. I unpacked slowly, deliberately, reclaiming each item not as clutter, but as evidence. Proof that I had lived, that I had mattered, that I was not done yet. That evening, I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea, watching the sun fade behind the buildings. No yelling, no stares, no silence that hurt, just quiet, peaceful quiet, the kind you choose. My phone buzzed once. Peter, a missed call. I stared at the screen. I didn't pick up, not yet. Because now I was busy rebuilding. And this time I was doing it for someone who actually deserved it. Me. I didn't tell anyone about the documents I signed with Charles. Not Peter, not Chloe, not even Judith. It was mine to carry. Just like all the things I had carried alone for decades, unseen, unthanked, unacknowledged. A few days later, Charles called. It's official. 50% of the house is now under the Southern Women's Historical Preservation Society. Congratulations, Agnes. You've made history part of history. I thanked him, then hung up the phone and sat still for a long time. Not in hesitation, but in calm. The kind of calm that comes after a storm has passed. Not because it gave you peace, but because it taught you who you are. I looked around my new apartment. It wasn't big, it wasn't perfect, but it was mine. No one sighed when I placed a picture frame on the table. No one rolled their eyes at my crocheted throw blankets. No one treated me like I was interrupting their lives. For the first time in years, I could breathe. I began settling in, not just physically, but emotionally. I unpacked every item with intention. Not as if I was decorating, but as if I was reclaiming. I placed my mother's mixing bowl on the shelf. I hung a small painting I once kept hidden because Chloe said it was tacky. I displayed my family photos in the hallway, phases of people who had loved me without condition. Every object became an act of resistance, a statement. I am not done. I am not disposable. I am still here. A week later, I received a letter from the Historical Society. They were delighted by the donation and eager to begin work converting the home into a heritage site. They asked if I'd like to contribute stories or background about the family history to include in the exhibit. I cried reading that letter because someone wanted to hear me, because someone thought my memories mattered. I spent 3 nights writing. I told them about my grandmother's migration from Georgia, about the garden my mother kept during wartime, about the ring Peter once used to propose to Chloe. It had been mine. I told them about Sunday dinners, about laughter, about struggle, about faith. I didn't mention the insults. I didn't mention the suitcase. I didn't need to, because this wasn't about bitterness. This was about preservation, of truth, of dignity, of women who gave and were always the last ones remembered. When I mailed the packet, I felt lighter. That's when it happened. Chloe texted, "We heard from someone that you gave the house away. Is this some kind of joke?" No greeting, no, how are you? Just confrontation, as always. I didn't reply. An hour later, Peter called. This time, I picked up. "Mom," he started, his voice already tense. "What is this about the Historical Society owning half the house?" I didn't raise my voice. I didn't tremble. I just said, "It's true." "Why? Why would you do that without telling us?" I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. "Because when I tried to share things that mattered to me, you didn't listen. When I tried to belong, I was made to feel like clutter. I gave you a home, Peter, and you gave me silence." There was a pause, a long one. "I didn't mean, you didn't stop her," I said, and that was enough. He exhaled sharply, but had no response. "You're still welcome to live in the house, but it's no longer a private home. It belongs partly to a greater purpose now, to honor the stories that built it." "You didn't have to do that," he said, quieter. "I had to do something," I replied. "For me." We ended the call shortly after. There were no tears, no screaming, just silence again. But this time it didn't hurt. This time the silence was mine. The next day I received another letter from the Historical Society. They wanted to host a public exhibition and asked if I'd attend the planning committee. Me, at 73, Sitting at a table, being asked for input, being valued, I said yes. That evening, I made tea, curled up in my new armchair, and opened the locket again. Inside was a faded photo of my mother as a young girl standing in front of a sewing machine. She had raised 6 children during the Depression, buried 2 of them, worked in a textile factory till her hands bled. She never once asked to be honored, but she deserved it. And so did I. My new apartment began to feel like home, not just a place I stayed, but a space where I belonged, where I wasn't shrinking to fit into someone else's expectations. I wasn't being dismissed, corrected, or tolerated. I was simply allowed to be. I bought a lavender plant and placed it by the window. The smell reminded me of my mother's linen drawers. I hung soft curtains and allowed sunlight to stream through in the mornings. I rearranged my books by feeling, not alphabet. I cooked meals I liked. Things Chloe once said were too old-fashioned. Now they tasted like comfort, like freedom. And in the quiet, something inside me began to heal. I no longer checked my phone for Peter's messages. I no longer replayed that dinner scene in my head. The moment I gave away part of the house, I had unknowingly taken back a piece of myself. And the woman I found underneath the grief, she was still strong. The Historical Society invited me to their first planning meeting. It was held at a small community center. As I walked in, I saw women of all ages, some with silver hair like mine, others in their 30s and 40s, speaking passionately about preservation, family, and forgotten stories. They greeted me with warmth. "You're Agnes Miller?" one of them asked. "We've been reading what you wrote. It's beautiful, powerful." I felt my cheeks flush. "Thank you. I never thought anyone would care about those stories." "Well," she smiled, "you were wrong, and we're glad you were." For the first time in years, I sat at a table where my voice was invited, not tolerated, not overruled, not ignored. They asked questions, they listened, they took notes. One woman even asked if I would consider speaking at the exhibit launch next month. I almost said no out of habit, but then I remembered I wasn't the invisible guest anymore. I was the ancestor whose legacy deserved the light. "Yes," I said softly, "I'd be honored." The exhibit preparations moved quickly. They scheduled interviews with me to record oral history. They asked me to bring more items, photos, recipes, handwritten letters. For once, no one asked me to clean up the clutter. Every wrinkle in the paper, every faded ink stroke was celebrated. A week before the opening, I received a formal invitation in the mail. Elegant cardstock, gold lettering, the stories she carried. Honoring Southern women's legacy. My name was on the program. I was listed as a featured speaker. I placed the card on my table, right next to the locket. It was the most important invitation I had received in decades, and I didn't need permission to accept it. The day of the event arrived. I wore a navy dress and pinned my mother's brooch near the collar. I took a cab to the library hall, where the exhibit was being hosted. The building was old, with tall windows and echoes that held memories. Inside, the display cases had been arranged with care. There it was, my box, placed on a velvet cloth under a warm spotlight, labeled Agnes Miller Family Archive, 1902 to present. People walked by, reading, some took notes. Others looked up and met my eyes with quiet reverence. That's when I saw them, Chloe and Peter. They stood at the back of the room, Peter in his usual quiet slouch, Chloe with crossed arms, and that half-fake smile I knew too well. I don't know if they came out of guilt, curiosity, or simply to reclaim control. But they weren't the ones holding the microphone anymore. I stepped onto the small platform. A podium stood before me, and the room quieted. I took a deep breath. My name is Agnes Miller. I'm 73 years old. I am a mother, a daughter, a granddaughter, a woman who spent most of her life making sure others had a place to belong. I paused, and then one day I was told, directly or silently, that I no longer belonged. Eyes locked on me. No one blinked, not even Chloe. I used to believe that being quiet made me gentle, that staying out of the way made me loved, that sacrifice was the same as safety. I was wrong. I placed the locket on the podium. This belonged to my mother and her mother, and now it belongs to history, because the stories of women like her, like me, matter. They are not trash, they are not clutter, they are our roots. I didn't cry, I didn't falter. I stood tall, I stood free. When I stepped down, I didn't look at Chloe. I didn't look at Peter. I looked at the crowd, and I smiled. Because for the first time, they saw me. After the event, people came up to speak with me, some with tears in their eyes, others with warm, quiet nods. Women pressed their hands into mine and whispered, "That was my mother's story too," or "You said what my grandmother never had the chance to say." One young woman, maybe in her 20s, hugged me unexpectedly. "You reminded me of who I want to become, not who the world tells me to be." That moment clung to me long after the lights dimmed. I never realized how many of us had been asked, ordered to stay quiet, to shrink, to fade. But the silence was finally breaking. The exhibit would remain open for 2 months before being converted into a permanent digital archive. They asked if I would be willing to record more stories, contribute background information, maybe even help mentor younger women in the Preservation Society. I said yes, not out of pride, but because I now understood that preserving our stories is not a luxury. It is an act of survival. Peter and Chloe never approached me that day. They stood at the back during my speech, then vanished quietly before the applause faded, and I let them go. I was no longer waiting for validation, no longer hoping for their guilt. I didn't need them to say I was right. I didn't need them to say anything at all. For the first time in years, I felt whole, on my own terms. A few days later, I sat by the window of my apartment, sipping peppermint tea, watching the late autumn sun stretch across the street. The scent reminded me of my mother's bedside drawer, old linens, dried herbs, and quiet resilience. That's when the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting anyone. Peering through the peephole, I saw Peter. He stood there with his shoulders slightly slouched and a small frame clutched in his hands. I opened the door but didn't speak. He looked up. His eyes weren't defiant or angry. They were uncertain, small. "Can I come in?" he asked, voice low. I nodded and stepped aside. He walked slowly to the table and set the frame down. It was a photo of him and me. He must have been 5, maybe 6. We were in front of the old backyard swing. He was grinning, gap-toothed, and wild-eyed. I was kneeling behind him, arms wrapped around his shoulders, my face glowing with love. "I found this in one of the kitchen drawers," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Didn't even know we still had it." I stared at the picture. I remembered that day. It was the first time he pumped his legs hard enough to swing without my help. He had shouted, "Look, Mom, I don't need your push anymore." And I had smiled, even though something deep inside me broke just a little. Because that's what motherhood is, celebrating the moment they stop needing you, even when it hurts. Peter fidgeted. I should have said something that night when Chloe. I raised my hand gently. "It wasn't just that night, Peter. It was every moment after, every silence you let grow. He swallowed hard. I didn't know how to fix it. You didn't have to fix it, I said. You just had to see me. We sat in silence. Not the old silence, cold, sharp, suffocating. This silence was heavier, but honest. I saw the exhibit, he said finally. I read every word. I didn't know half of it. You never asked, I said softly. He nodded, ashamed. I'm sorry. I know. After a pause, he looked up. So, what happens now? I smiled, not with bitterness, but with peace. Now you go live your life, and I'll live mine. And if one day we truly meet again, without shame, without pretense, we'll begin again. He stood, visibly emotional. I'd like that. As he reached the door, he turned back. Leo's been asking about you. My heart fluttered, but I remained calm. Tell him I'm still here. When the door closed, I didn't feel sadness. I felt release. I had loved deeply. I had been hurt deeply, but now I was healing deeply. That night, I opened the leather-bound journal I kept by my bed and wrote, Today I did not explain myself. I did not shrink to be allowed back in. I did not ask for space at their table. I built my own, and I am finally full. I placed the pen down gently and smiled at the journal. Then I turned off the lamp and lay back in bed, not as someone discarded, but as a woman who had chosen herself. Not a tragedy, not a relic, but a story worth remembering. And this time I was the one writing it. The exhibition remained open through the fall. I went back twice, once with Judith and once alone. Each time I saw new faces standing in front of the same box. My box. They leaned forward, reading the small label beneath the locket. They lingered at the handwritten letters, the faded photographs, the quilted handkerchief stitched by my grandmother. They didn't look away. They didn't mock. They treated those objects and the woman behind them with reverence. And somehow, in those quiet moments, I felt as though I had made peace with all the versions of myself I had once tried to erase to fit into someone else's life. Then came the letter. It arrived one Thursday morning in a crisp white envelope, bearing the seal of the Southern Women's Historical Preservation Society. I opened it slowly, not expecting anything new. Inside was an invitation. You are formally invited to deliver the closing remarks at the final evening of the exhibit, honoring your contributions and the legacy you represent. I placed the letter on my kitchen table and stared at it for a long time. There was no fear, no hesitation, just an awareness of how far I had come. Weeks ago, I had stood at that podium to reclaim my voice. Now I would speak not just for myself, but for every woman who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or left behind. I began writing my speech that same evening. No drafts, no rehearsals, just truth. Truth written by lamplight and memory. The closing night was cool and quiet. The library's great hall glowed softly with golden light. Candles flickered on each table. People wore scarves, boots, soft smiles. The atmosphere was different from the first time, less formal, more intimate, like a final conversation among old friends. When my name was called, I stood slowly and made my way to the front. As I reached the podium, I glanced up, and there they were, Peter, Chloe, and Leo. Leo sat in between them, his hands clasped in his lap, eyes wide with curiosity. He looked so much like Peter at that age, it knocked the breath from my chest. Chloe sat stiffly, arms crossed, unreadable. Peter looked tired, but present. I didn't speak to them. I spoke to the room. When I was a young woman, I thought legacy meant being remembered by my family. I thought if I poured everything I had into my home, my husband, and my child, it would be enough, that I would, in some quiet way, live forever through them. But love without recognition is not legacy, and sacrifice without memory is not honor, it's erasure. I paused. A few people nodded. Others held their breath. There came a time in my life when I realized I was no longer welcome in the story I had helped build. I was a footnote in the chapters of others. My voice, once vital, had become background noise. But instead of fading, I chose to speak, not to shout, but to preserve. Because if we don't hold on to our stories, they disappear, and with them, we disappear too. I placed the locket gently on the podium again, just like I had that first night. This locket belonged to a woman who buried 2 children and still smiled every Sunday. It passed through hands that cooked meals, scrubbed floors, wrote letters by candlelight. It sat on chests that once nursed and later trembled. It is not treasure in the way the world understands treasure, but it is sacred, it is proof. My voice didn't shake. My hands didn't falter. I looked around the room and ended with, I didn't give my story away, I gave it back. To the world, to the women who need to know they're not alone. And to myself, because I finally understood. I do not need a seat at someone else's table. I built my own, and I filled every chair with the truth. Applause rose slowly, then all at once. But I didn't look for approval. I had already given that to myself. As I stepped down, Leo ran up to me. "Grandma, you were amazing." I smiled, knelt down, and whispered, "Thank you for listening." Peter and Chloe approached quietly. Chloe avoided my eyes. Peter tried to say something, but I held up a hand, not in anger, but in finality. "You don't need to say anything," I said. Everything I needed to say, I already did. And with that, I turned back toward the room, my grandson's hand in mine, and walked into the gentle hush of legacy. It's been several weeks since the exhibit closed. The display cases have been packed away. The velvet cloths folded neatly into storage. The locket was returned to me in a soft linen pouch, its weight now feeling less like sorrow and more like proof. The letters, photographs, and heirlooms have all been digitized, preserved, cataloged, for strangers, for scholars, for descendants yet to be born. But their echoes remain. They live in the silence between breaths, in the pause before a story is retold, in the moment someone finally chooses to listen. Sometimes I sit by the window of my apartment, a cup of chamomile tea in hand, and imagine a woman across the country, a young mother, a widow, a grandmother, stumbling upon the online archive. I picture her scrolling late at night, tired but curious, clicking on my name out of nowhere. Maybe she'll read my story, the box, the insult, the silence, the defiance. Maybe she'll cry. Maybe she'll see herself in me. And maybe, just maybe, she'll sit up a little straighter. That possibility is enough. I used to believe that the only way to matter was to be needed, to be indispensable. I tied my worth to how useful I was to others, how much I could give, how long I could hold on. But I know now, being seen is not a reward for sacrifice, it is a right, and I don't need a statue. I don't need guilt. I don't even need an apology. What I have now is more powerful than all of that. A life that finally belongs to me. These days, I wake without an alarm. I water the small basil and lavender pots I keep on the windowsill. I walk down to the community library twice a week and help organize the donation shelves. I join women's circles and listen to stories, some spoken with pride, some whispered with trembling. Every one of them matters. The librarians call me Mrs. Miller, but occasionally one of the younger volunteers will ask, "Are you that Agnes Miller?" And I'll smile and say, "I'm just someone who finally stopped apologizing for being alive." Peter calls now, not often, but enough. He doesn't try to fix the past, and I don't ask him to. We talk about the weather, Leo's school projects, his latest drawing, how he's trying to bake banana bread from scratch, and keeps confusing baking soda with baking powder. Sometimes Peter brings Leo over. We sit on the floor and color. He asks me questions no one ever bothered to ask. "Why do you always wear that necklace?" he said once, pointing at the locket. I told him, because it came from women who survived harder things than I ever will. And because it reminds me that I am part of something bigger. He thought about that for a long time. Then he nodded, as if filing it away somewhere important. Chloe doesn't visit, not yet, maybe not ever. And that's all right. I've let go of the need to build bridges toward people who keep burning them. Letting go without bitterness. That's a kind of peace I never knew was possible. One evening, I opened my journal, the one I started in the days after leaving Peter's house, and wrote one final entry. They said I was too much, too loud, too stubborn, too sentimental, too slow, too attached, but what they really meant was I made them uncomfortable, because I remembered, because I refused to disappear. So I gave my silence every chance, and when it failed me, I gave myself back to myself. I closed the journal, kissed the locket once, and placed them side by side on the nightstand. No tears, no lingering ache, just breath, just stillness, just me. I used to think aging meant fading, becoming invisible, a soft outline of who I used to be, but I see now it can mean becoming more vivid, more unshakable, more entirely your own, because a woman's value is not tied to who still invites her into the room. It is born in the courage to walk in anyway, with her head held high, carrying everything she's lived. So if one day you find yourself holding something everyone else calls junk, an old letter, a faded photo, a story no one wants to hear, remember this: you are not clutter, you are legacy, you are memory made flesh, you are history in motion. I am 73 years old. I have been erased, I have been ignored, I have been mocked, but I am still here, still steady, still full of fire, still sacred, still Agnes. And now I want to turn to you, the one listening, watching, remembering. Have you ever been told that your voice didn't matter? That your memories were junk? If so, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment, share your story, even if it's just one sentence. Because silence is not where we end. It's where we begin again, together. Let's talk below. Don't forget to subscribe, because your story deserves to be heard too.